Okay, welcome to this session for the Royal Anthropology Institute Film Festival. This session is the future of visual anthropology in the wake of Black Lives Matter. My name is Dr. Shawn. I'm an associate professor of the University of the West of England, and I'm going to be chairing this session as well as participating. If I hand over to our next speaker, Dr. Deborah Thomas, if you could just do a brief introduction of yourself, please.
Sure. I'm Deborah Thomas. I teach anthropology at the University of Pennsylvania, and I direct the Center for Experimental Ethnography, which is a hub that supports faculty and students who are working through a creative practice as part of their research.
Thank you very much. And Dr. Sireita Mullings, you introduce yourself, please?
Yeah, so I'm Sireita Mullings, and I'm a visual sociologist and community arts practitioner, photographer, and I guess a researcher working with various themes from youth enterprise, youth arts, community-based arts, participatory arts. I tend to draw upon post-colonial studies, as well as the work of the Black Arts Movement and the Caribbean Arts Movement. I teach at the University of Bedfordshire, as well as at the University of the University of London, Goldsmiths.
Thank you very much. And thank you very much for participating in this session today. And, you know, now in this age of kind of online teaching, online seminars, etc., it's good that we can have an international dimension to this. So thank you very much. I know it's there early in the morning for you, Deborah. So thank you, Deborah, for your participation today. So what we thought we'd do is kind of a round table where we're talking about this theme of the visual anthropology in the wake of Black Lives Matter. But what we've asked each of us to do is to choose a piece of media, like photography, piece of video, that we respond to talk about that theme in a broad way. And we've all got very different pieces of media, and I'm sure we've got very different responses to that central question. So I think it should be a very rich session. So I just want to then just start off by us having a discussion about the main theme before we go into our individual kind of contributions. So can I ask Deborah to start with, when you saw this title that we're asked to respond to, of the future of visual anthropology in the wake of Black Lives Matter, you know, what was your initial response? What do you think about it?
So I thought that, you know, what used to be called ethnographic film has gone through so many transformations over the past century, really. And, you know, what has, I think, become exigent for many of us is using film and other creative arts practices as a way to bear witness, you know, and also, you know, through a visual medium, find ways to undo the power of images in a certain kind of way, if that makes any sense. I mean, there were so many images from this past summer that have become iconic in different ways, and that have really given voice to the various aspects of struggle that have been ongoing, you know, and the forms of state violence and structural violence that have been ongoing among Black communities globally. But I think too, we always, you know, run the risk, and this is something that critical visual studies scholars talk about all the time, of exacerbating the forms of violence through images, right? And the kind of hypervisibility, especially as it relates to Black bodies globally. So I think there's a fine line, you know, that we walk between witnessing and also refusing that kind of hypervisibility, and using images to perform a kind of care and accountability. And you know, I think that's what's been compelling to me about working through film, and I'm sure I share that with both of you.
Thanks, thank you very much. Sireita, what's your initial thoughts when you saw this title? You're on mute.
When I, is that better? Can you hear me? Yep, sorry. So yeah, initially the title made me, really think about the changing definitions of anthropology, as well as the emerging sort of disciplines that have come about, visual sociology, and how it is that we are somewhat responsible, if you like, to ensure an interrogation with community narrative. You know, Black Lives Matter and the conversations that have sort of surfaced within the past year, for me, are not necessarily, they're not new. They're not new issues. They're not new conversations. The approaches and the ways in which communities or people choose to perhaps amplify their voice may be new, or they're taking nuanced approaches. But the narratives themselves have been going on for a long time, and I think it's our responsibility, irrespective of visual anthropology, visual sociology. It's our responsibility to really bring those to the surface. So when thinking about the future of it, for me, it's about making sure that those sort of buried stories are heard.
Yeah, I mean, I think the thing I definitely pick up on what both of you said is that, it's a continual conversation. It's not new. And as you said, Deborah, what's been happening is building on a momentum that's come before. And that's very much how I feel as well. I mean, even as a discipline of anthropology, I studied anthropology at the School of Oriental and African Studies in London, at SOAS. And for me, when I was studying anthropology, it was trying to wrestle with its colonial past, and this is going back kind of the late 90s when I studied there. So it felt like, the words decolonization and decolonizing the curriculum weren't around then, but it felt like with the scholars in that space and the my fellow students in that space, it was going through that process of, okay, why are we sat here as individuals coming up to the new millennium at that point and studying this discipline of anthropology, which we know is hugely problematic in its colonial history, but wanting to see how it can be made relevant for the future, and I think, so when I first saw this title, it kind of brought me back to that kind of context of conversation. I say it's nothing new, and me going into that space of anthropology and calling myself a visual anthropologist, I've been wrestling with this question ever since I made that decision to study it. Do you know what I mean? Because I came to that space because I was interested in African discourse and Black discourse and the struggle and post-colonialism, all of these kind of things. So it has been a conversation of how to make anthropology relevant and ethical when you're working in that space, which I think is an interesting tension, I guess. I don't know how you feel about that.
Oh yeah, I totally agree. I was a professional dancer prior to going to graduate school, and I quite accidentally ended up in an anthropology department, but very soon realized that it was the place for me, that I had landed in the right lap, so to speak, and I had a fantastic advisor also who made me feel like this was the space for me. And I guess I tracked my own lineage within the field through figures like Zora Neale Hurston or Catherine Dunham, other Black women performers, artists, theater artists, organizers, community workers, who were using the tool of anthropology and found within it a kind of methodology that fit what they were already doing. And that's what I felt too. But I recently told my students that, in reading those older texts, it's like one always has to, if you're me, or maybe you've had this experience also, you always have to kind of suspend disbelief, not only because of the way it's written or the things that it's addressing, but because I think at base, what I realized is that I was never the audience, for those texts. They were not writing with me in their mind, and I feel like what's different for us, whether it's in what we write or in what we produce in terms of film or what we do in terms of theatrical work or sound studies or whatever it is, whatever the media through which we're working is, I feel like we have a much more targeted sense of audience and therefore of the kind of mode of working. It's collaborative, it's participatory, it's supposed to be about something, and it's serving, the certain communities rather than merely serving the sort of production of theoretical knowledge. That's also important, I think, because the knowledge that we create challenges, many of those older ideas or older tropes. And that, of course, is also a form of decolonizing. But, to me, so much of this revolves around audience and who's in your head while you're making work. Yeah.
No, absolutely. I mean, this is how me and Sireita met around these conversations. We were both doing our PhD at the time, and we are both interested in that approach, how to say, participatory practice, working with young people, trying to make it ethical, trying to work with people. How did you relate to Sireita? How did you relate to what Deborah was just saying there? So I think there's lots of affinity with.
Yeah, there is, and but I just wanted to say, I was thinking, you are my first virtual turn real friend. Do you remember we met online? I've never done that before. And then we because of the synergies with the work, it was like, well, we needed to keep the conversation going. So yeah, you were the first person I'd ever met online, and then arranged to meet. So it's kind of like, for me, it was I think it's quite important because it's also a signifier of the time that we are working in. I mean, of course, for young people now, it's nothing, having friends in the virtual, that's just normal for them. But I started to think about my entry point. So I went I did an undergrad degree at UWI and Edmund Manley College, the Visual and Performing Arts in Jamaica. And at the time, I was very much interested in just doing photography and graphic design in a commercial way, and that was how I was going to make money. I returned to the UK, to the community where I was raised, which was Brixton, and then I realized that something had changed. And I wanted to understand what was going on with the young people there. But it also reminded me of the reason why my mom sort of encouraged and sent me to Jamaica, right? Because there was something happening with young people that she was uncomfortable with, and she wanted to save us from, if you like. So here I am. I've returned, and I've embarked on this master's in multimedia, but there was something that wasn't satisfying for me. And I remember being outside Lambeth Town Hall, and at the time, do you remember Connections? So Connections was that was the home of Connections. I saw all these little ads in the window, and I'm thinking, oh, job center, let me check it out. And someone who I knew from a long time ago comes out and says, oh, well, long and short, why don't you come and do some work with the Youth Advocate Program, with the Lambeth Youth Offending Team? And I'm, at the time, I want to be an art director for, whatever. So it was the furthest thing from my mind, but it was an interim thing. And it was, whilst there, it became really apparent to me that there were government strategies put in place to just sort of monitor and babysit these young people. Despite the fact that they were producing work where we could have interesting and important conversations and learn about their lived experience and how it is they understood their social positioning. For me, it felt like those projects were not being taken seriously, and we weren't encouraged to interrogate the work in any meaningful way, which sparked all sorts of ideas. And I knew that I never intended to embark on a PhD, right? But I knew that in order to sit with it, I needed to do it in some kind of formalized, structural way. And at the time, I was developing quite a number of youth exhibitions. So the Digital Expressions was the first youth exhibition that I curated at the bottom of the recreation center. There was, I think it was the Brixton Gallery or something at the time. And I came across a speaker. I mean, I might be going off a little bit, so you might need to tell me to hurry up, or but in terms of how you enter into this mode of thinking. So I came across Professor Les Henry, who really opened up my mind to how it is we need to be thinking theoretically about our own social positions and our relationships with these young people. So that was kind of the beginning. Then I got, sort of chucked into the Goldsmiths arena, and sociology definitely wasn't a place I envisioned myself. Then I remember Professor Les Back saying, "I've got something for you." While I'm there struggling, thinking, I don't think I can do this. I'm not sure this is for me. Yes, I need to understand social theory, cultural theory to make sense of what's going on, but I'm not sure. Visual sociology. And that was when I felt comfortable, because I was able to bridge practice with academia. I mean, at the time, I never even had that language, but it became much easier for me. And very important. So I was able to clearly see, how it is that young people were making sense of their own realities and their social world. And I wanted to be able to amplify that.
Yeah, no, thank you. I mean, yeah, I think I always enjoy going back to those entry points, as you say. So I think they're really important in helping us understand how we got here and why we're here and what we're trying to do with the space. And I often think that, particularly like, Black and brown, practitioners, if you like, within anthropology, sociology, that often can be this, as you said earlier, Deborah, being mindful of the audience and why we're doing it, and it being in service. That can also get interpreted as activist. I've been labeled a activist academic, and I'm not sure how I feel about that, because I think the very presence of being a Black body in a space can be seen as political, even when you're just, do you know what I mean? When that's not an active kind of position, kind of thing. But yeah, as myself coming through as a photographer and filmmaker in the space, and then coming to theory, as I say, with my MA, I kind of think one of the things that I started to take notice of was, you mentioned Zora Neale Hurston, Deborah, thinking of, also Jomo Kenyatta. I remember being in an anthropology's department of an old bookstore and seeing Facing Mount Kenya by Jomo Kenyatta, the first president of Kenya, with an introduction written by Branimir Malinowski, and seeing, okay, yeah, Black people are in this space and it's not just a recent thing. And and Lenita Jacob Huey, African-American, anthropologist, with her paper, The Natives Are Gazing Back, I've really gravitated to recently, because I'm really interested in, how us in these positions, particularly when we're in the academy now, so we're writing papers and we're affording that kind of platform. Yeah, absolutely. What is that space we're occupying between, in service or activist or participatory, and for me, this question of the future of anthropology, visual anthropology, for me is very much in the space of, okay, let's start, what are we doing in this space? We're no longer have to see ourselves as the minority in this discipline. Do you know what I mean? It's like, what are we now interested in? What are we stories telling? And I think particularly it makes me think about methodology, because I think very often where I'm seeing studies, PhDs, other studies of Black and brown people in these spaces, often there can be an emphasis on methodology and how we're trying to make the methodology ethical and meaningful and in service and working with people, not doing to people. So we're trying to change the discipline while we're doing the discipline, trying to inform the discipline as we're doing it, and that always interests me, really. I don't know how you might respond to that kind of thing.
Yeah, I think that's happening for so many people on so many different levels. And, while that has been an ongoing pursuit, I think for many people, it the need for accountability became quite clear last summer. I mean, I sit in one of the oldest anthropology departments in the United States, one that is housed in one of the oldest ethnographic museums in the United States. And so you can imagine that there are many, 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 many layers of problems within a space that actually held many of the originators and promulgators of scientific racism, you know. So, you know, there are so many levels at which, excuse me, this is because it's early here. There's so many levels at which these kinds of decolonizing practices must be going on. And yeah, one is at the level of curriculum, for sure. I happen to be teaching this year both intro classes. So for the undergraduates and for the grad sort of cultural core students. And, you know, the undergraduates, we've revamped that course, and I now teach it as Anthropology, Race, and the Making of the Modern World. And, you know, sort of focus on that sort of that moment of contact in the new world, you know, as the moment in which new hierarchies of humanity are developed, new forms of global socioeconomic integration, et cetera, and try to undo for them the idea that anthropology is about studying other people, because so many people young people come into our classes with that in their minds, and trying to help them to understand that actually what we are studying is systems of power, and that what we must study is the ways we're all implicated in the development of these systems of power. And so their project for the class was to create the website for a conference we're doing in October called Settler Colonialism, Slavery, and the Problem of Decolonizing Museums. So I think, you know, they were able to kind of put a lot of the theoretical work that we were reading into a kind of practice in figuring out how to, you know, how to think about different people working through these decolonizing modalities, but in very different ways. And then in the grad core, you know, usually our final assignment for that class has something to do with the project they want to, the research that they want to conduct, you know. So it might be to develop a research proposal or to write a paper about some element of that. But this year I decided that I thought that their final paper should be a kind of extended reflection on almost method in the way that you're saying it, you know, why they are the person to conduct this research, what kinds of relationships they need to build in order to ethically conduct the research, what kinds of questions they need to constantly be asking themselves that have to do with the forms of collaboration and accountability that need to emerge through the research process and beyond. And, you know, what is it that draws them to the question, you know, for them to really interrogate why they're interested, you know, what it is about the question and their own background, their own experiences that can come together in a productive, but also very self-aware way, you know, so that they're all asking themselves the question, why do I want to do this? Which I think we naturally ask ourselves because we find ourselves in a sphere that is not really, that was not originally built for us, you know, or that isn't really considering us in a certain kind of way. But you know, and of course there are a lot of students of color in that class and international students in that class, but at the same time, I think we all have to check our biases, you know, and think about how they're going to inform what we do. I mean, me as a dancer, I was coming in trying to think through the ways as a student, you know, the ways artists have been involved in political movements. And in Jamaica, dancers were very involved in the anti-colonial struggle and also in setting up all of the institutions like the Edna Manley College of Visual and Performing Arts, right? And so I was interested in what the underlying basis was for why they were doing what they were doing and how they were trying to change, you know, people's minds about Afro-Jamaican music, dance, ritual practices, etc., and elevate them as like the basis for a national identity. But of course, I had a bias that that's good and that that's right, and that that kind of process is important and necessary in certain kinds of ways because it was what I was already doing. So even I had to sort of rethink, like, why would somebody not attach to these processes? What is it about the differences of experience within the Jamaican landscape and how it's connected to all of these other global landscapes through migration, through structural adjustment, through the IMF, et cetera, that would create different sensibilities around the work of kind of middle-class artists, in the national sphere, and what it is that people who don't attach to those kinds of things, or who only attach to them at like festival time or something, what it is that they feel is more indicative of their own sensibility of why it's important to be Jamaican, or what's important about Jamaican culture. So I think we all have to go through those kinds of processes, and to I think it's important for the students that they think about that from now, as they're devising a project, not just when they're in the middle of it.
No, thank you. Before we go into the next stage of the session, Sireita, is there anything you want to respond to that? I was thinking about co-creation when Deborah was talking about it then, and that element of participatory, and that was in a formal education setting. Sireita, you worked in informal arts and education settings as well. I don't know if there's anything you want to reflect on that element of co-creation.
Well, one of the things, or one of the places that I have come to through this process of co-creation, both in an informal and formal setting, is being able to draw upon the artwork that I have been exposed to, and really interrogating its social and political significance, and finding ways to get young people to, I say young people loosely, to get participants. And it's not just participants, because when we're talking about educational spaces, they're not participants. So if, to get people who you're engaging with to make sense of what's taking place through these works, and I must say, I did not learn about the Black Arts Movement until I was at Edna Manley. And we're talking about the Black British Arts Movement. And that was as a result of my photography teacher at the time, who'd come from Birmingham. And she felt, she was quite passionate about sharing with me the work of Keith Piper, who I'd never heard of before. So imagine, I've gone way across the Atlantic, left Britain to learn about the Black Arts Movement. By that time, I'd already undergone significant study at the National Gallery. So I was quite grounded with, the Caribbean art history, and proud that I'd learned that. But it was just a little bit disturbing when I realized that I knew nothing about this work, which told and explained so much, explained quite a lot with regards to communities, stigma, some of the problems that were happening, and the sort of class structures that had emerged as a result of those problems. Just very quickly, when I went to Jamaica, I was told not to speak about where I came from, because it was seen as a place of trouble. So don't talk about it if you don't have to. And it wasn't until returning, and like I said, coming back with that art history knowledge and understanding, well, what were those 1980 insurrections about? I was, being able to connect the dots, and using the work to also connect the dots for my students, and get them to not take their, again, their social positions for granted, was quite significant. And, you know how it is, we take on jobs for different reasons, and you normally to survive. And I went into the University of Bedfordshire. Yeah, I needed to survive. And there was something that said I can bring something here, even though it wasn't clear, because I'm working in the School of Applied Social Studies, and there isn't a visual arts program. There isn't a visual anthropology, a visual sociology. It doesn't exist. And I'm having to really carve that out, right? It's challenging and it's interesting. And I'm seeing students enjoy it. It's sort of, it seems, you know, without sort of, polishing my halo, it seems refreshing for them to be able to, because I try to make it a point of my duty to draw upon the visual all the time within every lecture, you know, in order to situate or pull up and unpack whatever we're looking at, whatever theoretical position we need to interrogate. The thing that I'm constantly trying to ensure is the applied aspect of it. So you're talking about people who are taking on practical professions. How does this relate to them? And that's the interesting part for me. So I don't know if I've spoken to what you asked there, but
yeah,
that
no,
was how
absolutely. No, thank you for that. And I think this conversation is a good warm up to the next section, which is us discussing images that we've chosen to respond to, and for each of us to kind of talk about our own kind of bits of media that we've selected for about 10 minutes, and then see where that kind of discussions go. So I'll start off by showing this particular image. So this photograph was taken in the city of Bristol, where I am now. I've lived in Bristol now since 1996. This photograph was taken by a gentleman, a photographer called Keir Graville, on the 7th of July 2020, and I'm sure it's an image, or it's an event, even if it's not this particular image, that a lot of people are familiar with. So just to put it in context, 7th of July 2020, a Black Lives Matter protest happening in the city of Bristol, UK, and the protest culminated in the statue of Edward Colston, who was a Director General of the Royal Africa Company and one of the leading figures in Britain's involvement in the slave trade. It stood for 125 years, and now it was pulled down on the 7th of July and rolled through the streets and then thrown into the River Avon in Bristol. And, you know, the headlines hit the news and it became a really big moment globally, and, you know, instigated toppling of other statues in other countries as well. So this became a really interesting moment for me. I've been working on the history of Bristol's involvement in the slave trade and Edward Colston's involvement in it for about the last 20 years. You know, I've made television documentaries about it. I've done academic papers. I've done participatory projects, working with young people to explore the history. So lots of different iterations. And I myself have gone on a journey with even what should happen with the statue. You know, for most of the part, I would say that I was more interested in the statue being recontextualized, a new plaque being put on it, or another statue placed nearby, rather than the statue itself just being taken down. And it's only more recently, in 2019, when I wrote a paper with Maura Burhard-Champ about the history, that I came more to the conclusion that the statue should be removed. And the reason why I came on that journey, where I started to feel like it should be removed, is that I did a visual analysis of the statue, and the statue is grade 2 listed statue, so it's protected by the state essentially as a building and as a fabric of historical importance. And a statue is its material, it's permanent, or we think is permanent, and you see it whether you want to see it or not. You'd be on a bus, you know, going to get some food, and there's this thing, and it's like a building in the space. And it really is this civic statue memorialization about how the civic state, how the city wants to tell its narrative, how it wants to be seen, how it wants to be recognized, how it wants to be commemorated. So I kind of did this analysis of the statue, and I kind of discussed it in relation to a painting by Tony Forbes, a Black British Bristolian artist, and it's called Soul Down the River. And it's a painting of him getting dragged under the suspension bridge, and Colston is dragging him under there, the statue. And I talk about how, you know, the city bought that painting for permanent display, and it's in the local museum as a permanent exhibit, but it can't compete on a kind of a narrative scale with a statue. You know, to see the painting, you have to be in a museum, in the right floor, in the corner. You know, there's a purposeful set of actions to be able to see the painting rather than the statue. It's just there. It's a fabric of the city, and it doesn't kind of compete. But seeing this particular, the reason I've chosen this particular photograph is seeing the scale of it. I just love the detail, the individuals. You can see all the people. But often when we talk about Bristol and Britain, if you like, in the slave trade, and you know, those people that are against statues being commemorated of slave traders or street names, it often gets boiled down to a black or white discourse. You know, it's the black community, as the people from St. Paul's or Easton, and it can often get reduced in these kind of binary, you know, very reductive demographics. Well, when you look at this photograph, it's hugely, you know, so many white people in that space being very proactive in their kind of connection with that particular event, and it really kind of cut across a lot of the discourses. There's no doubt that this event really polarized the city. You know, there's huge amounts of people in the city that did not agree with the statue getting teared down, even if they didn't get teared, even if they don't agree with slavery, they don't want slave traders being memorialized, but they still didn't agree with the statue taken down. So there's huge amounts of nuance in this. From a kind of anthropological and sociological kind of discourse, it reminded me of Emil Durkheim's notion of anomie. Anomie is this idea that there's a lack of usual social and ethical standards in an individual or a group. And I've always been inspired by this notion of anomie, because it really speaks to what we consider to be the norm, and why would people act against norms, even if it's there, you know, even if it's, you know, is this just a one-off event, a one-off set of actions and behaviors that the next day after this, they wouldn't ever dream of doing anything like this again. The day before this, they wouldn't dream of doing anything like this again. But there was a particular moment when the stars aligned, and, you know, this particular event happened and all these people were involved. So I'm really interested in what does it mean for individuals and groups to act in a way which they wouldn't usually act in, but there's a collective consciousness or collective set of values which at that point seems like the right thing to do. So I'm always interested in, I guess, that nuance and complexity of behaviors. I guess I'm interested also in how anthropology deals with topical issues and kind of journalistic moments, if you like. You know, anthropology's very much one of these discourses which, you know, synchronic. It makes things static, turns events into an object, and then you study it. You know, and what James Clifford called the salvage pastoral, when it's often looking at particular nations, or as anthropologists, even though I don't use this word myself, but tribes and these different communities, and starts to freeze them in time, as if if a whole community is a photograph, and studies their behaviors and things like that. So I'm always interested in how does anthropology, sociology, maybe sociology more so than anthropology, but deal with these moments of very specific topical events which can't be ignored. And is anthropology really going to be studying this in 50 years time, maybe, rather than now, when it might be more slightly journalistic, you know, analysis kind of thing. So I'm interested in that. So here we've got this kind of, if you like, there's a macro representation, and you could also talk about a grand narrative representation of Bristol. It's got this history. We've been trying to get the statue taken down, and then this is what happens. So there's a grand narrative approach you can take to telling the story. What I call my approach to anthropology is I call it small anthropology. And what I'm interested in with what I call small anthropology is the micro, it's the small. it's the specific. And I know that that analysis has been done on my people by anthropologists back in the day, and they've got everything completely wrong. It's been really misrepresentative, and I know there's huge flaws in grand narrative attempts at anthropology, you know, making universal claims. So I attempt a much more, I guess, humble approach where I don't try to make universal claims, and I'm interested in small anthropology. So I want to kind of get into the small anthropology of this moment and this day, and also coming from an autoethnographic. I'm really, a lot of my, you know, anthropological work is autoethnographic. I use my own experience to try to illuminate or extrapolate some of these wider conversations. So I wasn't there during the daytime of that event, so I'm not in that big crowd that you just saw Keir Granville take the photograph of. I had family members that were kind of suspected of having COVID, etc., and I didn't want to be out during the day, you know, on this protest very early in lockdown. Do you know what I mean? It just wasn't something I felt comfortable with. And I also have to say, even though I worked in this history for 20 odd years, I did not see it coming that the statue was going to come down. When I got told it had come down, I got sent a video literally minutes afterwards. I was, first of all, I was shocked that it happened, and then I thought, of course it came down, of course today it came down. You know, we're in the middle of a pandemic, we're all been isolated in our spaces. George Floyd, we've seen, was murdered in that really horrific you know, situation in the United States, and the energy and the attention was very different to any kind of protest that kind of came before. But I did go there in the evening. I went there in the evening. This is my friend Rob, and I'll explain the context. But similar to what we're doing before, I want to kind of tell you what was going through my head when it led up to me going there in the evening. During lockdown, I got an allotment, and it's, you know, it's the first time I've ever grown anything. Complete novice to it, and I spent the day on the allotment while this kind of more chaotic scene was happening in the city centre. And then when I finished at the allotment, I rang up my friend Rob and I said, Rob, let's go and see the Colston thing. You know, there'll be less people there now. Let's go. And we picked up Louise as well. Louise is a former colleague of, well, a current colleague of ours. And this is where I think the context is interesting, because myself and Rob, we made a documentary called Under the Bridge about this very history in 1999 for television. Rob presented it and I directed it. Louise started working with us a couple of years later, and she was producing lots of the participatory work that we were doing around slave trade history, etc. But when I picked up Rob, and when we picked up Louise and went to that space, none of that was in our minds. We were just three friends that wanted to see what happened. We didn't go there with our media hats on or with an academic hat on, do you know what I mean? Or our portfolio. We just said, oh yeah, we got some spare time, let's go and see what's going on. So we went down there and I started taking photographs of the space, you know, just with my mobile phone. I started taking photographs of the placards, and we were there for about 15 minutes before this moment. And I was taking all these photographs, and I literally said to Louise, I might come back tomorrow because I'm not really feeling any of the photographs I'm taking. Do you know what I mean? You know, sometimes when you're taking photographs, you're just not getting the right angle. It was a bit chaotic. The backgrounds weren't tidy, and I just wasn't in, you know, for some reason it just wasn't coming together. So I said, oh yeah, I might come back tomorrow and take some pictures, and you know, I might be get a few more successful images rather than today. And then about 30 seconds later, Rob just came out of nowhere and he said, shall I get on it? Shall I get on the plinth? He didn't hear my conversation about the photography, but he said, shall I get on it? And Rob's a very extrovert individual. He studied drama at university, hence why he's the presenter of TV programs. I'm always behind the camera. He was in front of the camera. And I was like, yeah, if you want to, get up it, you know. And so he literally just dived up there. It's not something I would have done because I'd have been too scared to fall down and be embarrassed or something. And he just climbed up it, did this pose, and I just had my mobile phone and I just quickly took, and I think I've just got 3 frames of this. And then he quickly got down. He didn't even really check that I was taking pictures of it. I'm just glad I managed to capture it. It was in focus and all the rest of it. So it's a very impromptu moment that only after the fact I suddenly made sense of. It made complete sense that Rob was on the plinth rather than me. It made sense that I was taking the picture. Do you know what I mean? All these things were very serendipitous and accidental, which often I think research is as well. And I think, you know what I mean? I'm interested in the messy kind of rhizomic approaches to, you know, guitar-y, messy approaches to research, because I think it should be responsive rather than really methodical kind of thing. So yeah, so this moment happened. So I put it on social media and it got, you know, liked and retweeted as you do. And then it's now being held in the local museum in their collection. Do you know what I mean? They saw it, they were like, oh, you know, we would like a copy of this. And it was completely accidental, even though I could, when I put it against my portfolio of academic writing and my film practice, it could look completely deliberate and completely staged, if you like. Do you know what I mean? But that was just a happy series of accidents that this kind of came about. So, you know, so, you know, I've started to talk about this image in different lectures and different talks and blah, 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 blah. But I guess when it comes to, I'll just end wrapping up really with a couple of thoughts of making sense of this in a kind of anthropological, sociological kind of way. It started to make me think about Frantz Fanon and Wretched of the Earth, particularly this first picture and the sort of the multiplicity of images and voices and agendas at play here. And in Wretched of the Earth, he says, Frantz Fanon says, to take part in the African Revolution is not enough to write a revolutionary song. You must fashion a revolution with the people. And if you fashion it with the people, the songs come by themselves and of themselves. So it's about this ground up mentality. You know, no one could have been there that day and said in a very rational way, right, what we need to do is take the statue down, because when this happens, there's going to be this knock-on effect, domino effect. Do you know what I mean? If you try to explain this before the fact in a very rational way, there would have been, you know, lots of dissent. There would have been, you know, it just wouldn't have happened in that same way. But because it was a groundswell from the ground up, and the song came from the people, if you like, the song is the energy to do this effect in this kind of anemonic way, this anime way, talking about M.L. Durkheim earlier. It made sense. It was very spontaneous, but it made sense in that moment, in the same way that this made sense in that moment. But if we tried to foreground theory and rationality, you know, these kind of things, then, you know, those moments would have looked very different, felt very different, and different things may or may not have happened. So I guess it's anthropology in the spirit of serendipity, anthropology in the spirit of not planning. We like to plan everything, but actually not planning a research project, not planning an intervention can be possibly more ethical than trying to plan it. Because when we plan it, that's coming from us. When we're not planning it, we're responding to the situation, and that can come from the ground up. So when it comes to Frantz Fanon inspired Paulo Freire to write Pedagogy of the Oppressed, and Pedagogy of the Oppressed inspired Augusto Boal to write Theatre of the Oppressed. So, you know, it went from theatre to education to the arts, if you like, through Frantz Fanon, Paulo Freire, and Augusto Boal. But all three of those theorists foreground participatory practice, co-creation, ground up methodology rather than top down agendas, if you like. So I will end there. So yeah, that's what all of that made me think about. So I don't know if any of that made sense, or if you had any responses to any of those things. I'm not actually sure how long that was either, so I apologize.
Yeah, well, maybe I'll take the pass from your, I mean, so much of what you just said resonates with me the focus on small moments, the need to be responsive, what you said about serendipity. You know, I often find that that serendipity happens when things are right and just, you know, like otherwise you get roadblocks and resistance. So it's that those moments of serendipity are so important. And I really love what you did with those two images. So thank you for that.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Sireita, I don't know whether you just very quick responses to any of that.
Well, yeah, I'll try to keep it quick. I hear you loud and clear. Yeah, what jumped out, what struck a chord with me was the idea of messy research. That's the serendipity and the way in which we sort of find ourselves sort of meandering through a thing based on some calling, you know, like you're pulled to the thing that you need to untangle and unpack. And yeah, that definitely is something that I see happening in the work that presents itself to me that I then embark on. So yeah, I thought that with the thing with the messy research, you spoke about methods and, you know, the grand narrative and the way in which we, if I've got it right, you know, are sort of pushing against those original structures and redefining the disciplines, right? And I often get so flustered with trying to fit my way of thinking, which is very messy, within these very neat frameworks, right? You know, I'm a divergent thinker, my mind's all over the place. And you know, constantly having to rein myself in, rein what I'm experiencing in, because, you know, the journal article ain't gonna wash, you know, if you know, and you need to be scientifically rigorous and that kind of thing. And I remember looking at you know, a radio program in Peckham, doing some work and looking at the power of the anecdote, the power of the narrative, because I think, you know, in this context of messy research and serendipity, when things emerge, sometimes you can't, you know, the scientific rigor, you can't put that to the front of your mind in order to make sense of what's going on. You know, for me, it's secondary sometimes. A lot of it.
No, good. Thank you very much. Thank you. So Deborah, we'll come over to your contribution now. Yeah.
Well, so speaking of narrative, I guess, the focus of my own work, both artistically and in terms of scholarship, has been on creating and assembling archives of violence in Jamaica. And this practice has really been geared toward generating difficult conversations about the relationships among personhood, politics, and violence, and toward opening new spaces in which people can connect with each other across both time and space. And space here could be geographic space, generational space, sociocultural space, or political space, but to gather in order to think through their own relation to these archives, and in thinking through that relation, toward elaborating new foundations for social worlds, for liberation, right? And so this has meant working with existing archives, which are difficult because they are colonial or otherwise surveillant. And it's also meant developing new archives, which are often narrative, performative, sonic, visual. And for me, in this way, archiving is a decolonizing practice. We often talk about the violence of the archive, and especially the violence of colonial archives, because what one has to do to enter into that archive is either be property or break the law or appear in court or appear in a bill of sale, right? So this other kind of archiving and assembling archives, to me, is a way of decolonizing that particular practice. And so this kind of approach is what undergirded the Tivoli Stories project, for which I collaborated with Deanne Bell, who is a community psychologist, and musician and composer Junior Gabu Wedderburn. And with that project, we sought to bring attention to the Tivoli incursion of 2010, when Jamaican security forces supported by the United States entered the Tivoli Gardens community in search of Christopher Dallas Coke, who had been ordered for extradition to the United States to stand trial for gun and drug running charges. And the search for Coke, which did not result in his capture that day, did result in the death of at least 74 civilians at the hands of the police and the army, though community members put this number closer to 200. So the project, the Tivoli Stories project, spawned a variety of formats, including a museum installation and a short, non-linear, non-narrative documentary film and other things, but also a 40-minute documentary film, which is called 4 Days in May. And in that film, mothers describe watching their sons being executed. A brother mourns the killing of a sibling shot execution style next to his stepfather. An aunt talks about having to identify her nephew's body, part of which had been burned beyond recognition. Other young men describe being taunted by soldiers, made to run while shots are fired after them, being tied to other men and kept in a leaky bathroom overnight, not knowing whether they were going to live or die. So as the COVID-19 curfews wore on through May 2020, the 10th anniversary of this event, the Tivoli incursion, which had begun 24th May 2010, threatened to pass without remembrance. And on the evening of the 24th of May, we received a phone call from a relative who works at one of the national television stations, and she asked if they could screen our documentary the following day, since they had neglected to organize commemorative programming related to the anniversary. So as 4 Days in May aired on TV Jamaica the evening of May 25th, George Floyd was being killed by police in Minneapolis. And as Jamaicans decried this act of police violence across various media, the police and army incursion into Tivoli Gardens was rarely mentioned. And this for me generated a really loud and resonant silence. Anti-Black state violence has sometimes been an illegible formulation within Jamaica, because Jamaica is a majority Black country. And police violence and extrajudicial killing are not typically seen as part of the global phenomenon of anti-Black racism. But if we understand raciality as not merely tethered to physical appearance, but instead as grounded in historical, ideological, and onto-epistemological phenomena that produce whiteness as the apex of humanity, and that's a humanity that is transparent and universal, then we have to see the practices of law and security, which are designed to protect a liberal post-coloniality that sanctions whiteness and class hierarchy and heteropatriarchy. We have to see that as always and already racialized. Right, so positioning state violence within the rubric of anti-Black racism allows us to more obviously reframe the problems of legitimacy and accountability outside the dialectic, which often happens in places like the United States and maybe the UK too, which, that in that dialectic, Blackness signifies a kind of contradiction within liberal democratic humanism, right? And something that can be overcome through kind of incremental, perfectible allegiance to a kind of tolerance, right? And instead, we can see Blackness as foundational to modern processes of exclusion. So I say that all to say that my focus really has been on these moments of state violence that have either been forgotten or that have been disavowed in various ways. And in the films that we've made, the purpose has really been to create a different affective relationship to violence. And this, as I said before, has had everything to do with the different kinds of audiences that we want and expect to address with the different formats we're using. And I've written about this as a practice of witnessing 2.0, which I define as a kind of quotidian practice of watching and listening and feeling that is relational and profoundly intersubjective. So in this way, witnessing becomes a moral practice that involves exploring our complicity with contemporary events. And this is what the sociologist Avery Gordon would have referred to as responsibility, right? Responsibility, the ability to respond. So, and this is what brings me to the clip that I want to share. Our practice has really been concerned to develop archives of violence, we've also been concerned to develop archives of life, right? So anti-Black violence is, of course, not something that only recently developed, as we discussed earlier, and people have always created spaces in which they can refuse the terms of violence and where they can generate love and care, and where we develop alternative modalities of reckoning personhood and reckoning community, right? So one of the things I've been working on over the past few years with my friend and collaborator, Junior Abu Wedderburn, is a project that we sort of just call Bush Music. And this project has spawned a number of things, including an annual Kumina festival called Tambu Fest. And Kumina is a Congolese-derived community form that brings together musical, linguistic, movement, and spiritual practices that are connecting folk to the ancestors. During the period of plantation slavery and the post-emancipation era in Jamaica, these ritual practices were denigrated by colonial authorities, in part because they served as spaces for gathering, as spaces for communion, as spaces for the elaboration of counter-hegemonic worldviews among poor Black Jamaicans. So while practices like Kumina have been codified as the backbone of Jamaican national identity, today they're not really well known outside of a community of practitioners, even though Kumina actually constitutes the roots of contemporary reggae and dancehall music. So the goal of Bush Music is to amplify awareness of these ritual practices, at the same time understanding that people constantly innovate what are seen as quote unquote traditional forms based on their contemporary experiences, based on the availability of other instruments, based on their familiarity with drumming traditions from other parts of the Caribbean and Africa, and often just based on serendipitous things. At one event, for example, I saw women drumming Kumina, which is quite unusual that women would be the drummers for a ritual practice. So what is that based on? That the master drummer in that context didn't have sons, he had two girls, and he taught them how to play it, and they played it, right? And when they were getting up, the crowd kept shouting, no, no. One of them was wearing a football jersey that said Neymar, the Brazilian football player. They said, no, Neymar, Neymar, continue, right? So sometimes these things change just in the moment, as Shawn was saying earlier, and it gives us these kinds of serendipitous openings, through which we can think through the ways that we all innovate, in these quotidian modes. So we have also then been professionally recording elder practitioners of these traditions, and in collaboration with the St. Thomas Kumina Drummers Collective, we host this festival called Tambu Fest. And it's an event that brings practitioners together while also creating space for discussion about issues that are important to the community as a whole. So I'm going to show you a clip which was shot not last summer, because we couldn't do it last summer because of the pandemic, but the summer before, by a couple students who I had taken with us, Farah Rahman, who's now a PhD student at the Annenberg School for Communications, and Garden D. Assa, who is a PhD candidate at the Graduate School of Education, and also Joelle Paul, who was there and is friends of friends and now a friend of mine, and she shot some of the footage as well. And Farah and Dee work with a group called Camera, which is a graduate student collective. It's the collective for the advancement of multimodal research arts. And this collective is affiliated with the center that I direct. So I'm going to share my screen. And show you this clip.
call Grandy, yo.
Malem African people.
Me a go call Grandy. Me a one of them. Me a call Grandy. Musa Sen call me, yo. We go call Grandy. Malem. Malembe Yato. Malembe Panga. Malembe Kento. We are going from Africa. Yenge Yato Yala Malembe Kumasik. 1, 2, no. Call Grandy, yo. Ya go call Grandy. 1, 2. I'm going to let out the onion eucalyptus now. Call Grandy, yo. Ya go call Grandy.
So I want to talk for just a minute about what I love about this clip, and I'd love to hear, what you all saw in it. But for me, one of the things I love is that it really just captures the energy of a community event, right? One that features a practice with which attendees are likely familiar, but maybe not involved, but in which they nevertheless take part because it's what's going on in the community at one of the main gathering places on a Saturday night, which I think speaks to, somewhat to the question of serendipity, but also just to the kind of lack of clear boundaries between sort of ritual practice and everyday practice. And I think within anthropology, that's sometimes been solidified or too solid as a boundary. And I think it's much more fluid. And I think this particular clip gives us some sense of that. I also love that it's doubly mediated, that our students are shooting it and they're also filming people in the audience who are making their own videos. And I think this is so characteristic, not only of our moment, but of the ways Caribbean people participate in Black public spheres across diasporic locations. And Krista Thompson has argued that these kinds of what she calls technologies of vernacular photography facilitate a kind of spectacular visibility, and that this visibility produces embodied memories, in the face of disappearance or invisibility, and that they also potentially reconfigure the kind of surveillance or categorizing functions of the visual archive of Black people globally. So I see that in this clip. And, finally, as a former professional dancer, as I mentioned, I also love that when the women are seated in the beginning, you can see the kernel of what the movement is, even as they're resting, and that what propels them to rise up is that the kernel grows and grows until sitting can no longer accommodate it. And Reggie Wilson, who is a choreographer and director of the Fist and Heel Performance Group, and who's one of our center fellows this semester, and I'm team teaching a class with him called Kinesthetic Anthropology. Reggie would think of this in terms of the language of time, space, and movement. Right? And he would say that we can understand the choreographic dimensions of a dance or of an event or of a social movement in relation to an exploration of the time it takes for something to happen, the space in which that thing happens, which is layers upon layers of context, right? And the actions through which the thing happens in time and space. And I guess I'll just finish by saying that for me, doing anthropology through a creative practice, whether it's film or performance or sound or writing or photography, necessarily transforms how we conduct research, how we generate and disseminate knowledge, how we train students, and also how we remain accountable to the communities in which we interact and through which our research, circulates. And I think as multimodal ethnographers, We've long made our ethical commitments to interlocutors through embodied participation and collective knowledge production. And this is in part because we see creative practice as intellectual work, and as intellectual work that necessarily historicizes the inequalities that pervade our society, and that develops solutions for their present iterations through this kind of collaborative and participatory work. And so for us at the Center for Experimental Ethnography, which spans 8 of Penn's 12 schools, including the law school and the med school, a basic premise that underlies our efforts is the contention that an expanded and multimodal definition of what counts as scholarship will lead to a more diverse university community, and a community in which artistic practice is a cornerstone, not only for engaged and participatory democracy and social justice, but also for the reimagining and transformation of the university as a whole. It's in fact our mission to proactively reconfigure the kinds of students who enter our classrooms, the kinds of scholars who teach in them, the subject matter that is offered, and I think the very definition of what knowledge, scholarship, and intellectual productivity will mean moving forward. So I'll stop there.
Thank you. Incredibly rich and very moving, actually. And watching that clip was incredibly moving, I thought. And yes, so many things resonated. When you started off talking about the archives and the violence of the archives, and it kind of made me think about, the early anthropological images that I started to engage with and see, even before I knew anthropology was a discipline. But I might have been engaged by them because I'm seeing African bodies, in a space, not realizing that those images were captured in a really kind of violent way. And I'm thinking about the Louis Agassiz images of, Delia, Jack, and Renty, etc. This and Harvard Peabody Institute, so lots of things there started to think about. And when you start talking about the archives of life, and then thinking about the everyday life and everyday practices, and then how we as anthropologists, enter that everyday life kind of discourse, I think it was, really, really interesting. Something I'm particularly writing about at the moment is everyday life, and kind of seeing it there embodied, like you say, the embodied knowledges of that space in the Kumina space and the time, space, and action. And just a very personal thing, really. I'm interested in the idea of kinship, but not in the African kinship that's in traditional anthropology. I'm kind of interested in a much more looser way, that if I went to Pennsylvania now or London now and saw a Black person, in quite an isolated space, more than often we would kind of acknowledge each other. And I'm really interested in that. And the thing that made it very touching for me, the t-shirt design, the Sankofa t-shirt design on all those people there, I've never, I don't know much about Kumina, so I learned a hell of a lot just in that context. But that exact design of Sankofa, I have tattooed on my leg, and I'm really interested in.
And it's behind you too. Yeah.
Exactly, and I was just like, there's these connections that across space and time, don't know each other, never met each other, but there's a connection there that already, without knowing anything about Kumina or those people, that community, I feel very familiar. You used the word familiar. I feel familiar in that space already, and I wouldn't feel alienated or intimidated, because I actually know that I've got a permanent marker on my body that links me to them. Do you know what I mean? And I think that's really, there's so much there. So thank you for that. Thank you for that. Sireita, what's your response? You're on, yeah.
I was pressing the little red one in the corner. Yeah, there were a number of things that that struck me, actually. Of course, the energy and my own experience of going to Queenie's Night came back, partly because it was the first time I came to respect and understand spirituality outside of Christianity. And I was able to sort of confidently speak about it to my Christian grandmother, with conviction that this thing, it's there, and it's important for us to understand. And some of the things that came up for me was, gatekeepers of knowledge, and always wanting to understand, the knowledge that is embedded within that space, and how it is that we really don't have that privilege to access it in its entirety. And even as researchers, I don't think we will ever be able to, and I don't know if I should just settle with saying that, but I have said being curious is not enough. And so I've sort of stepped back and sort of left it alone. So much so, when I went to that Kumina space and was photographing, negatives disappeared. But and I think there's some, we talk about serendipity, and I think there's something there with making that decision of letting go, and of course not intending for the negatives to disappear, but there's something there that is forcing me to deal with that. But it's not about me. I think you speak about Sankofa, and I saw that, and that struck me because, of course, cultural retentions and the way in which cultural retentions are embedded throughout Caribbean culture, throughout Jamaican culture, and the first time I came to understand the significance of Sankofa was a fellow student was studying the grill work of the houses, so that's architectural work. And it was so, every time I saw the Sankofa embedded within the grill work, I'm like, look at that culture, it's just there. So those are some of the things that just that came up for me.
And that's Kim McKinson, yeah?
Sorry?
That's Kim McKinson, who is studying the grill work, yeah?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. And then what came about was this notion that I'm very much interested in, or the idea of a living archive, archives beyond the object, and how it is, we can engage with this living archive or not.
Thank you. And just to flag up one more serendipitous Sankofa link, because that's a Sankofa poster on the wall behind me, which I won't go into. That's got a whole other story connected. So Sireita, now for your offering, please. And I've got the video that you're going to show. So just cue me when you're ready to show the video.
Yeah, so I guess this does follow on from this thing that I picked up in Deborah's work, the thing about the living archive, that's within Deborah's work. I guess I should start by talking about the Voices from the Frontline as a project and how I got involved in it. I was very much interested in looking at how it is we, or people within the communities, are, active. I was interested in activism without a platform. Who are the people who are engaging in activism that force us to rethink and redefine activism? So you're talking about the 1980s, high unemployment, men deciding not to be a part of a system that they felt was not serving them. And I wondered if just the role of a hustler, how can we rethink activism through the life of a hustler, through the life of a hustler, and everything that comes with that. I wanted to know what was the gravitational pull about a particular space, Railton Road, the front line, how it served as the Facebook of our time, the way in which people would arrive, want to know who's here, just want to feel connected to home, and would go and stand up and find friendship. But what did it mean globally? Globally, it meant something else. Globally, it had a different face, a face that did not necessarily represent the truth of a community and what it was experiencing, and not just a community, other Black communities across England. And having experienced, as I said earlier on, going to Jamaica and sort of being told that you needed to deny that history was something I had to grapple with, was very painful. when I came to understand what it was about. It then meant, for me, young people who I work with needed to understand what was taking place on that space. What sort of who were the living archives? You know, when you know, throughout my time working at the 198 Contemporary Arts and Learning, there were various projects that would signpost the politics of the space. CLR James, Race the Day Collective, the Black Panther Movement, Linton Kwesi Johnson, Awad, the Women's Movement, Olive Morris. We can go on. And I thought it was time for us to identify the living archives on the road, and also get young people to feel comfortable with touching, feeling, and engaging with archives on their own terms, entering the National Archives, because it's a space that's a public space, as we know, that you can access and you can go in. And one of the things that I'd like to just quickly go to in terms of when the archive came alive was a letter that came from the Rastafarian House that was on, you'll know it, Shawn, that was in Kennington. And I think it was Ras Neptali, I can't remember his name, but you know, the young people were forced to engage, not when I say forced to because they were blown away by the fact that the Lion of Judah was on this letter in the National Archive. Like, that kind of stuff is not supposed to be there in their minds, you know. These kind of cultural signifiers that in their head lived and sat within a particular place, an informal space, was quite something that they had to grapple with. Reading the headline, you know, which was the salute, which was the salute to Selassie, was quite mind blowing for all of us, as well as it spoke volumes about our place within British history, and the fact that we needed to identify and pull up other significant moments and speak about them amongst us. So here we are, with the messiness of the methodology, right? It was very much a non-linear interrogation of the road. I tried to organize it in a way where we on a timeline that was signposted by doors. So you know, from 211, whatever was happening within the building is how we created this timeline. And as a result, some doors had living archives. I'm not sure if the video is now too long, but I wanted to perhaps just give you a little bit of the flavor of it with regards to this, the way in which the young people were participating on their own terms. We conducted a series of interviews with other members of the Brixton community who had an experience of that road, and spoke about what the road meant to them, and how it was characterized, or how they chose to characterize it on their own terms, which is you could imagine, or as you can see, there was this dialogical process going on, whereby memory was also used to inform. You know, as I said, I'm trying to make sense of the living archive, what constitutes it, how it is that we can utilize it methodologically, for me at least, in other participatory projects in a very clear way, if that makes sense. So if we can just look at perhaps a few minutes of that, because I do have other stuff to share. Thank you.
Yeah, it was just that spot. It was famous for being that spot, and it was where everybody wanted to come to be a part of what was going on, because that was the spot.
There was one long road, you know, from Atlantic Road right up to Railton Road. But there's only a specific part of Railton Road where you say is the front line. Halfway down Railton Road, right down to Atlantic Road into Brixton, that was known as the front line.
it was really all ethnic shops.
Just down the road there on the left-hand side, a man called Broderick had a little shop where you could buy West Indian food, you know, fried dumplings, ackee and saltfish and so on. Opposite, there was a cafe called Peggy's Cafe, where a lot of street people would go and you could get really good Jamaican food, you know. This lady called Peggy was renowned all over London for her Jamaican dishes. And beside that was a betting shop, and underneath the restaurant was a gambling house.
It was a colourful place. If you wanted to know about life and reality, you stepped down Rialton Road.
I was 15-year-old, right? When I met my mother had a little conflict. And I don't have nowhere to sleep or stay. So there's a place down the road there, right, named Bishop. They used to have a gambling house, an all-night party and a restaurant upstairs, and a gambling den.
You got to eat, so you got a restaurant there, you got a barber shop, you got a hairdresser, you got a taxi. That means you come and you eat, you buy your national food, and you don't want to drive or what, there's a cab over there. That's how it used to run. That's the memory of it.
It was the place to be seen. It was the place where people went and showed off their fashion, their clothes. They had a nice car, they had jewelry. You know, that was the place where if you wanted to be seen, you go on the line.
It was Hollywood in those days, you know what I'm saying? It's a different ball game now, you know what I'm saying? And we did not, there was no gun, there was only ganja. There was
I didn't know run-ins meant up to no good. Yes? I didn't know that should be a dive that plays good music. Yeah, do you see what I mean?
Shabine, yeah, that's son, yeah. I used to love going down there, actually. Well, it was a completely different world for me, coming from the countryside in the south coast.
the vibration amongst us in those days was just something else.
It's a place where the men, especially the men, they meet each other who they know from Jamaica. Yeah. And that was like a meeting place. Instead of going to each other's house and meeting at the individual house, everybody just meet up at the front line. And that's where we used to gather, chat, discuss, talk about the past and things like that, you know?
We had to run the gauntlet of the brothers on Railton Road. They were on the street corners and, doing whatever they were doing. And so you had to walk past them to get way down here. You know, we just sort of shot the breeze with them a little bit. Where you going, my sister? Oh, I'm going to my meeting, and all right.
We grew up on it, we eat on it, we play on it, we party on it, you name it.
Streatham, Norwood, Clapham, Camberwell, all these places. People come from all these places and meet up here on Railton Road.
Okay. Okay, yeah. So the clip was, it's really funny because I was there are different parts of the clip that give you a little bit more. And one of the significant parts we didn't get to was where Linton really gives the context of how the road was defined and aligns what was happening in Mozambique and what was going on with the apartheid in South Africa, and the fact that they felt like they were under the same sort of oppression, although that it was different, and they felt that they needed to defend their space. And if we hadn't engaged in that interview, or if young people hadn't participated in that interviewing process, they would never have left the project understanding the name that had been assigned and why it was assigned, and also the feeling that that young men during that time were living, what they were experiencing, and I think that was really really important. So yeah, that was the Heritage Lottery funded project, And as I spoke about this notion of the living archive, and it was really important for me at the time to sort of look at activism without a placard. That there's still a lot of work to be done, because I come under scrutiny all the time for leaving out voices, and lots of women who were also a part of that road. And the lady that you heard, which is Melba Wilson, she worked close with Olive Morris under the banner of Awad, and did amazing work. And she speaks about her work in Palestine that was organized there on Railton Road. Again, very important for some of the young women who were a part of that project, in terms of understanding the types of activism that people were involved in on the road, and how it is they were organizing themselves. But the living archive, as you can see, is quite important there. And that's one of the things that I was trying to focus on with that project. So very quickly, with regards to, is this, do you want me to continue talking about the others? Yeah. So very quickly, one of the young people who were part of that project, Jamar Samuels, she also lives on Railton Road. And what I found quite interesting with regards to the participatory process is, that the reflexivity that takes place within one's emergence of when I say emergence, I mean immersion of a project, being thrown in the depths of it, whereby the young lady was forced to think about her childhood. So you're talking about, she was at the time, she's now 20, probably 25. At the time when she did the project, she was probably like 22, and she was thinking about her 11-year-old self as a child, walking along the road, living on the road, not realizing, again, the social and the political history that was embedded there, not realizing that Linton Kwesi Johnson is somebody who she came to learn about in her adult life, but she had seen numerous times walking up and down on the road. The fact that her parents have a Caribbean takeaway, and he'd gone in there many times, it all came back to her. She was blown away. And so she wrote a piece, which I was going to read, but I think it probably is going to take up a little bit too much time. But just very quickly, she says, if you were to ask me about 5 years ago what Railton Road means to me, she'd say, I'd say it's the road where my yard is, in it. Well, depending on who you are, she says. And then she goes on to say, imagine going to see a Carla talk about the Haitian Revolution, and how CLR James was the first person to give an accurate account of what has happened. So those are just some excerpts from her writing, just to demonstrate how she was immersed within the knowledge, and also she sort of went through a rebirth, if you like, because she's received she produced a film that was nominated for a BAFTA, which speaks about the skin, colorism, and issues around race and identity. But what we get here is a young person who has continued her activist journey, and was able to reflect upon her 11-year-old self and said, well, I've been doing this for a long time, which in turn, as far as I understood it, inspired her to continue. So the images, I guess I should just share those with you very quickly. I don't know. Yeah, I should be able to just do that. These were the images that bear with me. So here you see, you're all able to see that, right? So that's Jamar sitting on her wall on Railton Road, reflecting on her childhood. It takes me to the work that she also found quite interesting when we produced a timeline. So we created a timeline of archives on Railton Road, And in 2014, one of the markers was a letter from Metropolitan Police, whereby PC Loveday gave a public, Metropolitan gave a public apology to the family of Cherry Gross. And I'm not sure if you guys are familiar with the Cherry Gross narrative, but just very quickly, the Cherry Gross was paralyzed. Cherry Gross was in her house with her children in 1985, and Metropolitan was searching for her son. Went into the house and shot her. So she was then paralyzed and died in 2011 as a result of the shooting. This is something else that a number of young people weren't aware of. What contributed to the 1980 insurrection? They know that their community is described as the place where rioting occurred. Didn't really quite understand what ignited the two significant riots, 1981 and 1985. Of course, the Cherry Gross case occurred in 1985. I'm going to fast forward because what's happened as a result of that, of the family's continued commitment to seeking justice, is the development or erection of a memorial that's going to take place. So we've got the Cherry Gross Memorial Pavilion site, and here's where the excavation is taking place. And I felt that it really speaks to now, in terms of you have statues coming down and you have memorials going up. And I think, yeah, that's really what I wanted to sort of speak about in terms of this sort of full circle engagement with cultural histories, young people making sense of what's happening within their communities, and the fact that these moments are very much alive. So this in itself is an object, and it's an archive. It will be an archive, and then there's the narratives that come from the families and offer different, I guess, paradigms, if you like, of living out archives, different types of living archives. And yeah, that's it from me.
Thank you. Yeah, brilliant. Again, really rich, and I think there's lots of crossover with what we've all been speaking about. Again, talking about the living archives, and that it crossed over of what Deborah was talking about with the kumana and the embodied knowledges in that space, and really enjoyed seeing that video and the individuals talking about the memories of that space. And one of the terminology that's right now is this idea of intangible cultural heritage, and this idea that within our communities, and comes back to what Deborah was talking about with everyday life and the archives of life, and how the memories, the stories that people have got to share, the scuffs on the road that people remember, that's triggering different things. And the fact that in these spaces, even though Brixton's known as a black space and a black community, there's lots of buildings that we didn't own in that space, but actually there's huge amounts of memories that we own, huge amounts of events that we own in that space, and there's a lot of ownership in that space, even though it's intangible, not physical, kind of thing. So I really enjoyed that. And just in terms of your final moment, thinking about statues coming down and memorials going up, and again, that's really important, and it crosses over with, again, what Deborah was talking about with Kumina and the importance of that space, the Coral Garden massacre, and why it is important to remember that, and Rob up on the plinth, and why he felt it was important to go at that. So yeah, huge amounts of crossover. So yeah, thank you.
Yeah, and I guess engaging with Jacob Hughes' work recently, since participating in this project. Yeah, the natives are gazing back.
Absolutely, with no apology.
None whatsoever. And I wanted to add that, you know, it was the gentrification really that catapulted me to get this going, because it's disappearing. You know, it's no longer seen as a black space. You know.
Absolutely, absolutely. Thank you, Deborah. Responses from you?
Yeah, no, I love the living archive, the moving archive, and the storytelling. You know, I'm always totally a sucker for that kind of work, and so enjoy, you know, learning from my own elders in that way too, about things that you maybe vaguely hear about, but that you hadn't experienced yourself. You know, regarding the gentrification comment, my grandmother, when she migrated, ended up in East London. And that's also a space that was primarily East and West Indian and is now hipster, you know, gentrifying so rapidly. And it's so strange now to walk those streets and not sort of have any visceral reminder, you know, of what life used to be and where the fish and chips place was. We used to stop when I was a kid, and, you know, the women in their saris and the West Indian food, the Jamaican food, really, it was mostly Jamaican at that time. But anyway, I really appreciated that, and the kind of the ways that working on these projects gives the youth working with you a sort of a better sense of how things happen in a more individual sense. You know, I think a lot of times we think, oh, these protests happen, or these uprisings happened, or, you know, but we don't have a sense of that those sparks that create the kind of collective mobility that you talked about, Shawn, are actually quite personal stories often, you know, and to sort of have people remember that, you know, when we look back historically, we see things in periods often, or we see, you know, these manifestations of discontent or unrest, but we don't know that what led to them were a series of individual actions, collective planning, meeting that was going on, you know, and then, you know, some spark that turns the thing into another kind of degree of volume, you know, and that's so lovely, I think, for that iterative learning process to happen in practice, in collaboration, and through this kind of intergenerational learning. I really appreciated that.
Yeah, no, thank you. And intergenerational, yeah, hugely important, because a lot of the things that we've been talking about, intergenerational, is there, you know, in the context of that. And yeah, so
no, it was definitely one of the things on the HLF application, because that's important.
No, definitely. Thank you. This has been such a rich conversation this afternoon, so thank you so much. I mean, I know we're gonna have to come to a close now, and we are going to be going live at the rest of this festival on the 23rd of March. So if you're watching this, please do join us on the 23rd of March, and there'll be a live discussion at 7:30 p.m. where myself, Deborah, and Sireita will be joined by Judith Aston, and we'll be talking about the emphasis of the multiple voice and the polyphonic voice and the multiple spectival voice, because everything we've been discussing, you know, there's a multiplicity of different narratives and perspectives, and Judith Aston is going to be expanding on that with us. But thank you very much for this discussion. It's been hugely rich, and I look forward to engaging with you again. So thank you, and if you're watching this, enjoy the rest of the festival. So thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, Shawn.